Hello, and welcome to another screen lecture of Mr. Mosier's American History 8. And in this lecture series, we're going to be looking at the tensions in the West during westward expansion. As we've been learning with westward expansion, we've been looking at three major themes. One, we gain a lot of land. Two, some groups will benefit from this expansion. And three, some groups will suffer from this expansion. In this particular lecture series, we're going to be looking at the groups that are going to suffer from this expansion, and that's the stories of the Native Americans. It's going to be a story of broken promises. As this quote reads from a text of a U.S. treaty that was signed with Native American tribe, "This land is yours as long as the grass grows and the water runs." And that's going to be a recurring theme as we look at westward expansion here and the story of the Native American people. It's an important story to tell as we look at westward expansion. Our first major story we're going to be looking at in this particular lecture series is the story of the Trail of Tears. This particular story is going to be the beginning of a very tragic story of Native American encounters with westward migration during Manifest Destiny. As Private John Burnett wrote about the Trail of Tears, "Murder is murder, and somebody must answer. Somebody must explain the streams of blood that flowed in the Indian country in the summer of 1838. Somebody must explain the 4,000 silent graves that mark the trail of the Cherokees to their exile. I wish I could forget it all, but the picture of 645 wagons lumbering over the frozen ground with their cargo of suffering humanity still lingers in my memory." The textbook that will go along with this particular lecture series will be Chapter 10, Section 3 out of our United States History book, pages 332 to 335, and the subject is on Indian removal. There are going to be three main guiding questions in today's lecture series. What was the Indian Removal Act of 1830, and how did this change U.S. relations with Native peoples? What was the Trail of Tears? So let's talk about this thing called the Indian Removal Act. That's going to start our discussion of the experience of Native Americans in westward migration. Before we get too far into our story, we need to kind of back up just a second and think about and talk about what was going on in the United States with Native Americans in the eastern part of the country before really westward migration really got moving. Before 1830, pre-1830, there are about only 125,000 Native Americans still living east of the Mississippi River. That would be in the eastern part of the country. Through warfare, through disease, the tribes had been greatly reduced in the eastern part of the United States. And that had been going on really since the beginning of colonization in the early 1700s. And even throughout the 1600s as well. So this has been going on for almost 100 to 200 years by this point in Manifest Destiny. Of the tribes left of the eastern part of the United States, they were really kind of some efforts by some of our early leaders, George Washington and others, to try and find ways to kind of bring them into the American fold, to try to civilize them as kind of American citizens. There actually were several tribes that existed throughout eastern parts of the United States, and they were kind of settled in their own area, their own region, and their own nations. Treaties had been signed previously that kind of gave that land to these Native American people. As you can see from the map here, there are several tribes. Some of them may sound familiar, like the Seminole tribe, which was the tribe in Florida that was raiding Georgia and the Georgian plantations, which kind of started the whole conflict with Spain that led to us annexing Florida. You had the Cherokee, the Creek, the Chickasaw, the Choctaw, and the Sac and the Fox. In 1830, however, Congress was going to pass a law called the Indian Removal Act. This law granted the authority to President Jackson to negotiate with these separate nations of Native American tribes to move them off their land and trade them for new land west of the Mississippi River in what would be known as Indian Territory, which is in basically modern-day Oklahoma and parts of Kansas today. The idea was sort of remove the tribes out of sight, out of mind. Already by the early 1800s, there was a desire to take that land, especially in the American South, where there was a need for more land for cotton growing, as well as there was some gold discovered in some of the mountain ranges in North Georgia. And so some of these groups are going to resist, and it's going to be met with pretty extreme violence. Some will go willingly, but the vast majority of them are going to resist moving west. So what's the Trail of Tears? Well, the Trail of Tears is kind of the description that's used to describe this forced removal of these tribes from the eastern parts of the United States to the western parts of this Indian Territory in Oklahoma and Kansas. About 1,000 Creeks will be taken out of Alabama and handcuffed and marched forcibly west by the U.S. military. And over 17,000 Cherokee will be taken from their homes in Georgia and led west by federal troops. Along the journey, 4,000 Native Americans died, which is why this is known as the Trail of Tears. It's really a trail of sorrow. Not only are they being forced to leave their lands and their homes behind, but also they were not prepared for this long journey. Many of them got sick from the elements, from the weather, and died from diseases. As one soldier commented on afterwards, this was some of the cruelest work I'd ever known. Now, not all Americans were excited or liked the idea of this forcible removal by the Native Americans west. Many of them protested this forced removal west. However, because of this idea of manifest destiny and western expansion, an attitudinal shift is going to occur in America of this idea that we're going to take Native Americans and we're going to move them out of our way, out of sight, out of mind. We're going to keep them out of our way, move them out of our way, move them out of our land, and move them to a different land so that they have their own place to live, that's where we don't have to necessarily deal with them. The Story of Us has a great video clip about the Trail of Tears. I definitely would encourage you to watch this video if you didn't see it in class. It'll be on the U.S. History Video On Demand section. The Trail of Tears is really the beginning of this very sad saga of Americans' expansion west and the treatment of Native American people. This is the story of removal of the Native American tribes from their land onto land set aside specifically for them, but it's going to become a very tragic story. We'll have more video lectures to talk about some of these other stories and aspects of western expansion. As always, if you have questions or concerns, please make sure you come see Mr. Mosier. I'll be more than happy to help you. Thank you for listening, and good luck.